All right. Chris, I also wanted to quickly give you an introduction. So Chris is someone I've been following his work for about 7 or 8 years now. He's deemed himself as a brand called Chaotic Product Manager. And
Chaotic
point.
good product manager.
Yeah, chaotic good product manager. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that correction. And it's very like his content is always the most sharp I've seen in terms of product space. So it's an honor to have you here, Chris. Thank you so much for making time for us, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me here. And yeah, I guess um, what I was meaning to talk about today, and we'll spend the full hour. I want to spend lots of time with questions if you have them, but I wanted to walk you through kind of three case studies. And in particular, I know that you're thinking an awful lot about like artificial intelligence and how you leverage those types of technologies inside of products. And so this one's going to be a little bit less tech focused and more on kind of the way that we end up talking between technical and non-technical people to be able to build these products. And that's maybe like my main mission right now is to do a better job of non-technical people like product managers. And by the way, the most hated TikTok I've ever been on is basically me saying I don't think product managers should be technical. And so, Apple user 135 thinks I'm an idiot, and it got like 20,000 views or something like that. So I don't think that product managers should be a technical role. I think they should be a role that is very specific about how they help be customer focused and oriented, how we help make decisions, how we build alignment, how we actually wrangle uncertainty. Those are the things I think product managers do. But when I say also non-technical, I mean designers, I mean legal people, privacy, security, safety, like a bunch of these different roles that need to come together to actually create something. And then there's the technical roles like engineers, ML researchers, data scientists, all those people that are like really in kind of the deep down knowledge of these technical things, and having discussions between those two different groups I think is really valuable. And so that's where most of these three case studies I'm going to be talking about will be related to that in some way. And so with that, I have slides to kind of help signpost for me, just so I keep us on track around this discussion. But I've been a lot of different places. You can see some of the logos there. That's not all of them. I have a very long and weird winding career. And then the one thing I just wanted to mention is if you were interested, I'm actually teaching a Maven course on some of the more in-depth topics here, and there's a discount code that I can send out later if you're interested. But that's why this is kind of in Maven branding, is some of this is stuff that I'm pulling out of that to be able to share with you today. So I think there's like nuance when it comes to the way product managers and founders deal with the nuance of AI and machine learning stuff. And I want to just set that as a framing because I don't want this to be a technical discussion. I want this to be more about like what is specific to this. And the reason why I say that there's nuance is, I think I relate this to when I worked at Kayak for a little bit, and that was at the point where desktop and mobile were about to intersect, and actually Kayak was going to be doing more mobile interactions with their customers than desktop ones. And at that point, my title included mobile in my job title. And at that point, I think it was very important for us to discover the nuances of mobile. Like, why would people use Kayak on the mobile phone? What were the reasons that they were doing that? What were the things that they were doing in their life that would go alongside this? And then how should that work between mobile and desktop? And so some of the key things we learned were, for example, that people wanted to do a lot of searching on mobile, but they did very little purchases. And the reason why we found out later was that people, because they had the access on their mobile phone, if they were just talking to a friend, they could say like, well, how much would it cost for us to go on this trip right now? And so they could just look at it. But they wouldn't buy things because if they're making a purchase that's like $1,000, doing it on a mobile phone at that point was really not considered to be like a regular transaction. And so if people felt uncomfortable, especially if Kayak was there to build transparency inside a very like opaque marketplace, they didn't feel comfortable. They didn't feel like they had enough information there. And so those were some of the things we had to start to learn about the patterns of usage, and especially the way that the technology was limited in mobile, mostly because of screen size and the way that rendering could happen in that case. But I think it's the same thing for kind of like AI and machine learning. What are the nuances that we need to now understand and build that product people should internalize as we're starting to think about these trade-offs? And so I kind of break it down to like three main things. And one of those things is data. So where you're getting data from, do you have the right to use this data? How we're actually cleaning the data or not, and things like that, I think becomes more of a product manager's job to think about because, well, so while there's like a model centric approach that a lot of people are using today, which is model architectures are what matter, there's a compute centric approach, which is if we just throw more compute at it, we make the models bigger, we'll be able to do a better job. And I think there's a third approach, which is data centric, that if we create kind of the best clean data set, we'll actually get a better model. And so that's where I think like in that case, we need to think about that much more. I think the way we train these models, well, the model architectures and the way that we actually end up kind of the specifics around training, I don't think is a product manager job. But the fact that like the cost and time is not just about the idea that an engineer is going to go in and build something and we need to maybe estimate or forecast how long that might take, or we need to build while we learn and we need to like understand that uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty in like the convergence of machine learning models as they're trained. And this is not only a cost issue, but it's also a time issue. And it's actually a sustainable environmental issue because of power that's actually used to train these things. So I think there's something interesting about like, how do you actually include this in the way that you think about the uncertainty? Because you may try to push to get high accuracy in the training round, but then that maybe leads to the next step, which is really around experience. So even if you have high accuracy, it may not be a good experience for your end customers, or it may fail in certain ways that are not actually acceptable for them. And so these are kind of the three main things that I think change a little bit or have a slight nuance when it comes to AI and machine learning kind of technologies being integrated into products. And so the first case study I want to talk about is something called field service operations. And so, and this is a story, I think, mostly about user research when it comes to AI and machine learning stuff. When I worked at a company called Philosophy, which was like a small design consultancy, we worked for we had a project for PwC and Google, where they were trying to sell more Google Drive or Google like work seats. And then PwC wanted to figure out a way to not automate, but build platforms for some of their consulting practices so they didn't have to spend as much people hours on things. And so field service operations are essentially where if you have something that you can't return to the manufacturer to have fixed or repaired, like a HVAC system inside of a building, or in this case, gas station pumps, you would hire a company to send a field service tech to then troubleshoot on site and then figure out what's going on and fix it. And so in this case, we worked, Larson was actually like our customer, was like our test customer, but we were trying to think about like, how might we build services that would then help field service operators actually do a better job? And so there are many different groups inside of this, right? So there are dispatchers that were getting information from the end customer about the problem, and then figuring out the job queue to then dispatch a field service operator, operations person to go on site, an engineer. And then they would also have to work with the warehouse to be able to get the right parts. And actually what was interesting was that inside these vans, there's probably about $120,000 worth of parts that were driving around inside these vans. So they would carry a lot of stuff just because they weren't always able to plan ahead. And so from this perspective, like, I was just trying to say, like, there's a bunch of different problems that are here that we wanted to think about how we might solve them in a way that was beneficial by, like, they would use like spreadsheets a lot of the time. They had actually a physical book that they would write every appointment down into. They would do a bunch of stuff through email and voicemail. And then there were a certain number of kind of like weird apps that they had built internally to try to help track and manage their work, essentially. And so there were a lot of things that we were trying to solve here. What we ended up actually going towards is a system that focused mostly on the dispatcher. And probably the important things around the machine learning aspects of this were a couple things. So one, there was a problem that when they got a job that would come into the dispatcher, the dispatcher wouldn't always have the technical knowledge to be able to figure out what was the problem based on what the customer was saying. And so using a prediction system to be able to say, based on this text, essentially, that the person had given us, what is the common problem here? And then we would look at things like their past history. We would look at the type of equipment that we knew was on site, and we would try to then predict what the possible problem is and what then the solution would be. The next problem was really around kind of making sure that we were creating a work schedule for the field techs that was functional and efficient and effective, and then also included kind of preferences for the different people that were working on it. So like some people that were very junior, they need to get more exposure to jobs, versus senior people started to have the seniority to be able to say they only want to do certain jobs and not others. And so this was also kind of a constraint programming problem, but included a lot of prediction aspects to it as well. And then, there were a bunch of other kind of like prediction things that went on with this that we wanted to prototype. And the last thing is maybe in this middle one you can't see as well. We'll get like a better screenshot for the next time I talk about this. But we created a bot that would be in a group chat with the dispatcher, and then would automatically add people like field service techs, the warehouse people, even sales or other types of senior field techs that could then help give advice, and would try to pull together a team automatically and then provide information inside that workflow. And so a lot of this stuff actually was never built, right? So we tested a lot of different things, mostly through kind of like high fidelity prototypes like this that were at that time inside Envision, because I think this is like, I want to say it was like probably 2018 is when this was, and but we were prototyping some of the machine learning stuff, but by and large we were just trying to understand like what was going on when it came to the way that like machine learning would help impact the system if it worked the way we expected it to. And so one of the things, and this was like an action shot that became part of like this was actually a tool that we ended up building. This was like this is a screen cap of like a PwC video that they put together to talk about this. And you can tell there's like a little bit of gamification that started to creep in at the end there, which I was not always happy about, but that was starting to become like a thing at that time. And so we had to include some of that stuff. One of the things that we did that I thought was very important first was to understand the system which these technologies would actually sit within. And so this is something called a rich picture. And a rich picture comes from something called soft systems methodology, which is this person, Checkland, who is kind of like a post-systems thinking cybernetics person in like the 70s and early 80s, started to say that like we could build this systemic thinking around this. We could build a system, try to understand that system. But there's always like these squishy things inside of the system that keep on like screwing up the way it works. And those are people, essentially. And so this idea of soft systems methodology consciously tries to say that we are built of socio-technical systems, which include people and processes and systems, that we need to observe all of it to be able to understand what's actually going on. And so one of the first things we did during the kickoff was do a rich picture, essentially. And so you can see here some of these like stickies that are like right here. Those are people. And then all of these lines are the way that these people end up interacting. And then these like little red kind of like swords that are crossed are challenges or frictions in the way that they end up working. And so one of the things that we started to look at, especially from like an AI machine learning perspective, is what were some of these challenges, and were those challenges something that might fit appropriately for a machine learning algorithm, at least based on our knowledge at that time. We didn't know about things like large language models and the way that generative systems would work. So we were not able to do everything that we would have wanted at that point. But and what I think is interesting about this is I think this is a precursor to I'm not going to talk as much about this type of workshop, which is called like analogous innovation, but this idea of how do you actually have a conversation about analogies within other domains to accept into your own. I think these challenges start to be like a really great place to start with that type of thinking. So I digress, but like this is a very important thing, that understanding all the systems that are actually involved, because what starts to happen is that even in today's world where you can have systems that are talking to other systems in a very particular way, like there's a great paper called Socratic Models, which is about how you using like human language to have models give content to each other. There's also another paper that didn't follow up on that one, but is like, I think the next step, which is once we start to do this type of thing, we actually see that inside these systems that if these different machine learning models are talking to each other, like they're chained together in some way, there are cascading errors that start to build up because of the way these systems work. And so I think this idea of like understanding the overall system itself is incredibly important, even if it's not necessarily in the domain that you're going to then create solve a problem for a particular customer in a particular way. You need to understand how the system works altogether. And that then led us to, we did a bunch of different like prototypes. We did a lot of, what would be referred to as kind of like either static, high fidelity prototyping of these things, or we would do Wizard of Oz style prototypes where people would try things out on the behind the scenes. It was a human being, but we would see whether it actually made sense. And so before we built anything, we would try this type of stuff out. And I still think that's super valid. What this is a picture of is that we would then get a bunch of different like nuggets of information. And Nuggets is actually a Tomer Sharon, who's like used to be a researcher at Google, and then WeWork, and then Goldman Sachs, and I think he has his own startups now. But he would talk a lot about like the nuggets of research. And so we would start to pull out nuggets from the interviews that we would do and then map them in different ways. And one of the things that I found was really helpful for machine learning projects in particular was this idea of kind of mapping clusters within the realm of the vertical axis here is not understanding to understanding what the machine is doing. So it gets at things like interpretability, explainability, the UX itself. And then there would be this breadth on the horizontal from like negative perception to positive perception. And what we started to do with the clustering was that anything that was below kind of the line of understanding, we assumed was either a change management issue, like they were not trained enough, we didn't have the right experience, or that in general we were just not doing the right thing when it came to interpretability of the system. And so we just had to go back and like fix that stuff. The stuff that was in the upper right hand corner was where they understood what was happening and they were happy about it. And that was usually kind of work that was annoying, right? And frankly, just like bullshit work. Is this was the work that they didn't want to do as part of their job and were happy to automate. And so those were things that I think also in another startup I did before this was around restaurant tech. I think we tried to automate too much at first, and so we lost a lot of trust, whereas we should have gone after kind of the small errors and things like that. The upper left-hand corner, which originally when we mapped this, we thought it was job security. Like it's doing what I understand it's doing, but I don't like it. And we thought it was like, oh, I'm worried about the AI taking my job, which is definitely a concern for some of these people. But the bigger problem was actually these were meaningful parts of the job. And so something that I learned in this case was that there were things about the job that people still wanted to do, right? Like they didn't want to do all the bullshit work, but they wanted to do these like very particular things that they thought were really valuable and core to their job in some way. And so I think this again gets back at like when we were starting to do research, we didn't understand necessarily what like the mindsets were in how we do this. And I can actually like, share a bunch of the questions, but I think like this idea of how would you explain the job like to a coworker? What are the things you should do here or not do here? There's a lot of things that are just about like the way that teams work that I think you need to start to understand when it comes to the way you start to include these things. And again, I don't just mean like tools, right? Because I think most of the time we talk about like a website or a tool of some type. But as we start to get into this realm of like agentive technology, as Christopher Nocell would talk about it, like we need to think about like where on the spectrum we're actually doing the teaming and where are we building these socio-technical systems. So I think that's very valuable and kind of important to think about. So I'll pause here. I mean, that was one case study where, again, very focused on kind of the way research is done, the way we think about qualitative research within the machine learning world. And it was incredibly important for the way that we started to understand this world. So I'll just pause here for a second. Like any questions or thoughts about this case study so far?
I just want to share one little nugget that you just said that I think is so enlightening. You said, go after small errors before automating too much.
Yeah.
That's like, that should be in big print on top of everything. That just like, oh yeah. So, because you get so excited to automate. No.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, because like I think the other thing about this too is that you do start to learn whether something is actually automatable or not. So like the big thing about the Amazon Go, just take it and go type of stores. The most recent study or most recent article about it was just that like it was actually like thousands of people in India that were doing a lot of scanning of this video to be able to see whether people were adhering to this or actually being charged correctly. And so this is a case probably where it became too expensive or too hard to actually automate some of the processes that they had. And they actually said it was related to the size of the store. So very large stores became a much harder and more cumbersome problem. So I think this is interesting too, that like when you start to like try to fix like little tiny errors, you start to collect much more information about like what amount of this can you even automate, right? And to your point, I think the trust that someone's putting into this tool, I don't talk about it in this particular presentation, but like there's a paper by Parasuraman in like 96, I think. And I can send a link to that. But it's all about like creating the right level of trust with automation systems, because if people over trust it, they use it when they shouldn't. If they under trust it, they don't enable it. And then if you don't build something that is actually appropriate for them, you end up creating situations where it's bad for them. And this is related to another paper that's basically about like moral crumple zones, which is that people get blamed inside of systems of automation rather than the automation and the system itself. So these are all kind of like interrelated concepts. I just want to bring them up because we don't have a lot of time today, but those are kind of like the constellation of concepts that I think are related to what we're talking about, like building the small thing, trying to fix the small errors that are just going to help someone, that make the system look very smart, right? And so you build more trust in those cases. So, yeah, what else? Any other questions or thoughts before?
No, I thought your other really good point was around, especially for us in sort of building like AI products, right? Really understanding the customer and what parts of the job is meaningful, and making sure that we're not automating the pieces that actually bring value to the individual.
Well, and also those like meaningful jobs, just to give you kind of like an idea, they were really about like helping customers. And so the idea that you could have a chatbot or an automated phone tree or system do something like that for you, it lacked the human connection that those dispatchers really loved about their job. Right. Like the moment that they could tell someone, hey, yeah, we're getting someone out there to your site today, like, well, that was just like that could have just been a notification. That type of thing made people feel cared about. Right. And so I think that's the thing that we're constantly trying to like balance inside these systems is like, where is the human element still really valuable for the overall like connection with your customers, right? Because if everybody's going to build some type of like chat AI, chat GPT like wrapper that is going to become something else, the only way you differentiate in those cases is actually the relationship you have with your customers. So yeah. Cool. I'm just writing some notes for myself, by the way. You're a great test case for some of the topics inside of my my Maven course, so that's why I'm writing notes. So thank you. Cool. All right. So the next thing is like a weirder case study, and so this is something called "How Does the Roomba Really Feel About Dog Shit?" And it's like a weirder conceptual study about the way that we end up doing actual prototyping. And so this comes from this concept. There's a professor that used to be at Art Center named Philip Van Allen. And so he did a paper that's all about like animistic design inside of machine learning systems. And what he talked about, and if people are not familiar with animism, animism is this like spiritual concept that every both like animate and non-animate object has an internal spirit. And so Japanese Shinto believes an awful lot in the fact that like there's certain rocks that have a spirit inside of them. And the thing that's interesting about and same thing with like the idea of like First Nation groups or certain types of lots of different cultures actually think about this idea of like animistic thinking. And the reason why they do this is because it's a way to understand a system by slightly personifying it. And by what I mean by slightly personifying it is that you actually give it a personality in a way that you can deal with it. So like the idea of a trickster fox from kind of like, again, First Nation peoples type of thing, is that you just shouldn't trust foxes because they will steal your food. And so like, it's not that the fox is a person, but it's the fox has the characteristics of a person that is a trickster. So you should watch out for them, basically. And so this is a way that we actually end up like internalizing and understanding things. This is also related to the fact that we see like human faces in clouds, right? Is that we're constantly trying to match to human experience in some way, just instinctively. And so this whole thing about animistic design is like, how do you actually create objects that embody some type of thing and do that thing in a way that makes sense for them? And so his first kind of like concept around this was this idea of having a bunch of different devices on your desk that are always listening to you, and that some of them will give you new things. So like the nostalgic in this case is someone that will show you pictures or ideas from a couple years ago, right? And so each one of these things has a slightly different use, but is very specific to the object of that thing, basically. And so what I began to start thinking about was like, and I did a lot of stuff with, I'll talk about like my Facebook Reality Labs experience with like Portal. I did a couple grants for a weird project called Urbit around like home automation and identity, but a bunch of stuff about how to like smart homes actually work, right? And so what I started to think about is like, people would name their Roombas, right? They would take care of the Roombas as pets in some cases. People do a lot of personification of this, but it's not that the Roomba is like a human, right? The Roomba is a Roomba. And so the Roomba does Roomba things. Like it will sometimes get stuck. It will sometimes act really weird. And actually like the whole thing about the reason why dog shit came up was really interesting to me was like, I don't know if people saw the articles, but it was like, if Roomba actually gets stuck on some dog poop, it ends up creating like these like horrible masterpieces inside of people's living rooms with the dog poop, basically. And so my question is like, if we were to like use animistic design to then talk about like, what does the Roomba actually want from the situation, want it with like very heavy air quotes, like how would we then design the way that we interact with that Roomba, and how would that Roomba then interact with other things inside the household? And so that's kind of the concept of this. And this actually turned into like a South by Southwest workshop. I did get like an IXDA honorable mention that year as well for this workshop. So I think it's like an interesting concept, but what it involves is two stages. So the first stage is this idea of like creating animistic understandings of a device. And so the way that we'd start to do this is we would name the device. We would talk about like kind of characteristics of this device that we would imagine. We would talk about special powers, and then we would talk about like what each of these emotions would actually mean for this type of device. And so maybe a clear view. I did this, like this was the South by Southwest. These were some of the sheets that they actually created there. And then I also did it online with a group called AI and Design. And so this was the idea of like a lamp, okay? And they named the lamp Gucci. The lamp is about like kind and generous and warm, and that they're happy when they shine bright, or they can help shine away for people. They're sad whenever they're like on for too long, like they're wasting energy. They're disgusted when the space is not clean. They're afraid when there's water around any power source. They're surprised when someone unexpected shows up, and they're angry when they're knocked over. And so what this is meant to say is like, not that this lamp is a person, but like, what do we expect this lamp to be like, right? So to go a step further, we then first of all do animistic design, which is like giving human characteristics to understand. And this is related to another technique I've used a lot called empathy mapping for the machine, which is more like for this technical system, what does it see? What does it think? What does it feel? What does it need access to? Like, what does it do in the world? Where we would usually talk about another person this way, it allows non-technical people to really build expectations about the technology. So that's what this is kind of doing in this like setup of the profile, right? Is it's basically using a non-technical terminology to then give requirements on what this thing needs to do. And then the second thing is actually doing role play. And this is another really brilliant prototyping methodology I've used previously, where in this case, I just set up a bunch of tape and taped a bunch of things to show kind of the outline of a house. But in the online version, we would put a bunch of things around the household, and then we would have scenarios that would take place. And we would have the devices interact not only with themselves, like what information would they be transferring to each other, but what people and how would they interact with those people. And so like a lamp, for example, you probably don't expect a lamp, like you probably want to be able to talk to a lamp. Like if I talk to a lamp and say, turn on right now, I probably want that to happen, but I don't want it to like come back and like talk to me. Like I don't expect a lamp to talk. I expect a lamp to be able to adjust its light bulb brightness, change colors, maybe flash. And so when we start to then talk about more advanced scenarios, like there's someone at the door or a package was dropped off, I expect maybe the lamp to be part of that scenario where I could say like, hey, something happened. Right? Same thing with like home, these like screens that end up being here. What we don't want is like, and I actually have like a picture of this. We don't want like the, Beauty and the Beast where everything sings at you when you walk into the household, right? And so anyways, like this example of like role play is something we've actually used when I was at Facebook. On the Portal device, we were working with the assistant team to understand when there's more than one person actually talking at the assistant, what should we do in that case? Because like not only is the situation that sometimes people just like talk over each other, but like the situation I would have a lot is my son would like I would say play one song, and then my son would immediately say to play a different song, and then we'd like be yelling at each other, and like should the assistant get involved at that point or not? And this gets to the fact that like in the end, we actually role played these different situations out where one person would play the device, and then we'd have people like pretending to interact with each other and interrupt each other. It was super awkward and weird, but we started to discover that we should not actually get involved in the household norms. We should always just take whatever the last utterance is. And that's the simplest way to deal with it, first of all. And second of all, it's what people actually expect. And so, we could have done things where we parse both of those, we understand both of them, and we say, we're going to do this and then that, or we could tell the second person, please wait, I'm going to take care of this first thing first. But all of those were incredibly awkward and weird, and we would get them wrong a lot of the time. So this was an example of like using role play of human beings to stand in for these different things. And so this also led to like another concept, which like with large language models, we can start to prototype things in a way that are very interesting. So I did something where, and there's an article about this if you want to read it, but it's like, what would happen if every smart home was a generative agent in some way? And because it can then start to understand what is going on, one of the big problems with smart homes is actually special cases. So you can set up routines, and usually the routines like on this day of week, this hour of day, do this thing, or based on this input, like someone walks in the room, do this thing. But there's all these special cases that start to show up that then break all of this automation routine. And so in this case, it was like, I could join, I don't have to like actually read this chat all the time, but the chat between all the devices in my home, if something went wrong, I could go in there and say like, hey, why did you do this? And it will say, like, don't turn on this light next time that there's a baby sleeping in this room. Maybe it's then able to not understand. And I try not to use personification language for models like this, but it's easier for me to be able to say, I have a special case that I need you to now deal with. And so this is an example of where like prototyping these things, I think, becomes actually much easier with things like large language models because it can pretend and it synthesizes or is kind of, being a synthetic agent in these cases becomes something that you could start to play with. And so I think there's like a lot of stuff in here about not only this idea of like animism, this idea of role play, but these are like ways to do prototyping that I don't think that kind of get beyond the like clickable envision or those types of prototypes that I think are really interesting. So that's, anyways, this is a weirder, more conceptual thing, but I've used this in real like planning for these types of products and found it to be pretty valuable. And by the way, the Roomba was actually terrified of dog poop. The person who role played it, and wanted to. And by the way, there was a whole like performance art aspect of this where we had meat bags that, because it's supposed to be like 1,000 years in the future where humans were extinct and that only the devices existed. And so like, what are humans? It is very weird. So anyways, so I'll stop here. Like, what questions or thoughts do people have about this kind of like idea around prototyping for these systems?
This is great. And my Roomba is named Hazel.
Okay. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's so funny.
But I can see like the last thing you showed, I can see where something like that could actually be really beneficial in the product that I want to build, because I want it to be something that's warm and engaging and friendly, so that the person, it's the trust factor you were talking about. So this,
well, and that's where I think like talking about how friendly this is always like an interesting meter to start to approach, and how you actually role play. Like role play can be an interesting way for you to test those different things, right? And also with generative, it gets easier to like do prompt engineering and stuff like that to be able to get like to do a prototype just through something like ChatGPT even. But I think there's something there about like the interaction part, and actually when I was doing like back in the day when design thinking was still kind of like the thing du jour, one of the things I would have people try out during like an AI conf workshop would be doing a role play of an autonomous vehicle and a person that's a passenger. And the things you start to realize are like all the different touch points you need to have with that thing while things happen. And then I also use like random events inside these role plays to then create interesting scenarios by which you need to, both the system and the person needs to react to. And so again, like dialing in how friendly is appropriate inside those interactions is really going to be important, right? Because that will build trust. Or if you're too friendly, you're too personable, they'll have higher expectations for what you're trying to do. And so then you are probably more likely to fail, is all I'm saying, right? Because of these automated systems. And so that's something to think about when it comes to this.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. What else? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the one thought I had was like I was thinking about how we could potentially like use personas to help kind of increase transparency with our kind of models. I feel like there's a certain part of the certain demographic that is really apprehensive about AI and ML, and like using these personas to try and like make it, to Patty's point, be friendly, but also like just increase transparency as well.
Well, and that idea of like different ways that, because I think maybe one other, like an orthogonal way to think about this would be like, it's actually, they have different trust in technology than other people do. And so in those cases, what's the stance of the product for them is going to probably be different than someone that's like a very early adopter that's very, that kind of just inherently trusts these types of things. So like one of the things that you could start to do is, one, you should be prototyping this with those people, right? And that's like a great point around user research in general, but also like you starting to think about that kind of discrepancy between your customers and, you know, either primary versus secondary personas, if you're going to use that type of concept, right? Like, are those the right people that you want to target anyways right now if you're going to niche down enough to something? But also how you might change the product based on the fact that they may, you know, again, I think that's the research you need to do, is to find out why they are that way, right? Is it because, and it may not just be that they're just like that type of personality or person, but it could be like a difference in trust of technology. It could be familiarity. It could be a bunch of different things, right? Like I think that's something we need to be very careful about personas. And that's the reason why like personas are really, I think, great as a shorthand, but if they're just like demographic personas, that's not helpful, right? Like it's more about mindset that really matters. And it's the job, and I don't mean job like as in job to be done necessarily, that is definitely something there too, but like, what is my role inside of this team or this functionality ends up becoming really important. So, yeah, and is that tool to agent kind of spectrum is really interesting. Like, is this an extension of me, which means that I think of it as a tool, it's a hammer, it's not supposed to talk to me? Or is it an agent and it's something that's supposed to go off and do something automatically for me, and that I need to interact with it in some more agentive, like not person to person, but like as a team, we're doing this stuff together type of thing. Cool. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is a case study around Facebook's portal. And so this was a device that basically did video calling, is the right way to think about it. Like, it was by Facebook, Reality Labs, and there's two like picture frame versions, and there were more of those as well. And there was one TV version. I actually still use the TV version a lot because it's the biggest screen I have in my room and in my household, and it's great for video calling my my mom with the kids and things like that. But the thing that I was working on in particular was really, I worked on three things: identity, just on the platform in general, the idea of biometric recognition, so both voice and video, and then like basically assistant integration, and included Alexa and our own internal assistant, essentially. Now, the thing that we wanted to do with this, though, was really all about, if you see in the center of this, there's like a little circle. This is a Google Home Hub, by the way. But the circle there is because that person was identified through the video camera. And so basically being able to identify someone walking into the room to then show them and personalize the device for their use, essentially. And so, you know, face matching would lead to a bunch of different things, right? So it would go from kind of this household context, which was more locked down, there was less access, to a personal one. There would be personalization of that screen. So it could show potentially like, what are my meetings later that day? Maybe like my music or playlists, that type of stuff. It could bring personal contacts into context. So like the household could access these types of contacts, but it would give me much more, all of my contacts rather than just the ones I thought anybody in the household could call. And then finally, like various privacy and security changes. So like you can't send messages in the same way, can't send videos. There's a bunch of stuff like that we have started to do, basically based on that. And so when I started doing this type of biometric recognition, especially for face, I first started asking a bunch of questions that I thought were the right questions, and they actually turned out not to be. And so those questions included like, what's the minimum number of pixels for a face to be detected and identified? And by the way, there's a difference between face detection and identification in this case because of the way models work. But the problem is that pixels really didn't mean anything in this case, because every one of those devices that we just showed had a different camera architecture, different lens configuration, had potentially different firmware that was governing what was coming out of those cameras. What is the minimum number of lumens? Like, how bright does this place need to be able to do detection and identification? Was not always the right thing, because like we didn't want to, yeah. So it was too technical for the type of thing. And then finally, like, you know, what's the acceptable minimum accuracy? Because we talk a lot about the model itself getting accuracy around identification or detection, like for skin tone 5, which by the way, we'd like classify people's faces by 5 different skin tones essentially in our data set that we were using to train the models. Like, what is the fairness across these different things, rather, and just looking at accuracy rather than looking at harms that might happen. And so I think this led, through this kind of discussion, I started to realize there were better questions I should be asking, or better trade-offs we should be discussing. And so one of those was like, how often can we not identify someone that's in the system, by the way, that won't be annoying? So like, how often can I walk into the room and it doesn't automatically identify me? And what are the circumstances by which it may not be that annoying? How often can we mistakenly identify someone that's someone else, if ever? Right. And the thing that's interesting about this is that for the false positive case that we're talking about here, inside of a household, usually people are more likely to look like each other because they're sometimes related. And so like that becomes like a weird issue, especially with twins, right? Like, so like people that are twins, how do you do facial recognition for them is a really hard problem, actually. The next thing is like, what expectations of people being detected when others are in the room? So like, how should multiple people in the room be identified if they all are part of the system? Or what about people that are not part of the system but are just there, right? Because inside my household, there are people that maybe don't want to enroll, like maybe my mother-in-law lives in the household but doesn't want to enroll, or can't enroll, like children that can't actually accept terms of service around facial recognition, or people that are just like visiting, like dinner party guests, or people that are cleaning the house or fixing the toilet or whatever, right? Like there's a bunch of people that go through your house that probably shouldn't be identified a lot of the time. And then finally, like, what are the harms that are there for people with different types of faces that may have problems with this? And so I don't even just mean skin tone color, but also the idea of like facial hair changes, the idea of facial tattoos. the idea of eyeglasses. There's a bunch of things that start to happen that will change the performance of the system, and how many harms will we start to cause based on that in some way. And so those are better questions, right? And so this started to lead to kind of like the way that we end up planning things. And, you know, I like to say that like some of the most important things that we end up like setting up as precursors, and this talks a lot about the idea of like, what are we doing to actually talk about guardrails or the way we specify these products. First of all, like values, customer segments, and problems, those are the things you should start with before you even start talking about machine learning. That's really, really important. Inside of Google though, and this is where this second half of this case study comes from, is this kind of methodology around guardrails that I'll talk about called design policies. We start with a product usually. We have something called critical user journeys, which are basically like end-to-end experiences that are really important to the use of the product by our key customers. And then we have these things called critical moments, which is like places where we should not get it wrong, basically. And this will lead to a change. So before we would write these out as kind of steps, maybe we'd have a prioritization table of like, here's the critical moments and how important they are. And as part of the work I did at Google with the PAIR, which is the People Plus AI Guidebook, which if you have not seen, I definitely highly recommend. It's called the PAIR Guidebook. It's great as far as like interaction. And the next edition that's coming out, I helped kind of create a bunch of, or I collaborated on a lot of stuff to make it a little bit more product oriented, not just design oriented. But one of the things that came out of this is these things called interaction design policies. And this is like a new way for us to actually define what a product should be doing or not doing when it comes to machine learning and AI, especially systems that are very non-deterministic or probabilistic in some way. And so these are kind of the four different types of critical moments that we want to talk about. And so one is acceptable actions. And that's like, what do we want the people, the customers, the users to do, and how do we want to react to them, or the system to react to them? For unacceptable actions, like what do we not want the customers to do, and how should we not react to them in those cases? There's thresholds of uncertainty where, because of probabilistic behavior or non-deterministic behavior, we may make mistakes, but they're mistakes that are acceptable and can actually be saved by the person themselves. And then finally, vulnerabilities, where there are like harms that will be caused if the non-deterministic system does something bad in some way. And so you can imagine, like in an image generation service, acceptable actions, right, could be that you try to just, there's a prompt that is given about some image, and we respond with a set of 4 images that are appropriate for that prompt. If you're someone like Google, you may put in unacceptable actions like pornographic material, violent material, material we're using like faces of famous people. We don't want people to ask for that, or we want to stop people from asking for that, and we want to not then give them what they asked, right? Thresholds of uncertainty will be like the quality of the picture. So maybe we don't get it right. Like maybe and this is where hallucinations are a really interesting kind of terminology in here, is that if this is meant to be a system that is generating images that are for creative purposes, you want hallucinations to take place because that's creativity. Where you don't want hallucinations to take place is if this was something to generate images of reality, that is where hallucinations are bad. And so this is the whole kerfuffle that started around Gemini image generation when it came to kind of the Asian and Black Nazis. It's like, if you want a picture of the founding fathers, maybe you should just go to Wikipedia rather than asking a generative system to create that. That's my own personal commentary about this. But like thresholds of uncertainty here is like, what is acceptable? So like if we give them kind of like a slightly photo that's maybe a little bit more hallucinatory and that it's more broad in the interpretation of this, it's probably okay in something like Midjourney, because I can then update the prompt. I can ask it to do some generations around one image in particular rather than the others. But we're not as worried about that quality because actually it's part of the interaction. And then finally, vulnerabilities is that we should not actually get a prompt and then return something that is probably pornographic or violent or something like that, right? And so these are all things that we want to like take into account. And rather than creating requirements that are very rigid, we actually want to actually create a bunch of these policies and then use those as a way to talk about trade-offs with our engineering team and even our design team, right? Our experience team. And so for the portal device, for example, right, like acceptable actions might be detecting various faces in the room. That's okay. We could just detect any face. And we actually use that to then do things like panning and zooming to then get the best framing for a person when they're on a video call. Correctly identifying people from their faces if they're enrolled, right? And I think that's a very clear distinction. I put a note there. But like when I say enrollee, I mean someone that actually has has opted into this service in particular. Basically not identifying non-enrollees, right, is very important in this case. And then finally, like, if we are going to show sensitive data or we deem to be sensitive data, we only do it based on the person is enrolled and identified and they ask to do it specifically. And so the example I would give here is that if you wanted to bring up your bank account balance on your TV, right, it should only be when you say that's appropriate. We should try to avoid doing that as much as possible. And this is kind of what we would call the read the room type of situation, where we're not going to try to police who's in that room. But if you say you want to show someone something that is sensitive, we will let you show it because you have in some way observed who's in the room with you and you've deemed it acceptable. And so that was like an important thing for us to kind of realize and start to put in this type of terminology. Next thing is unacceptable action. So we don't want to misidentify enrollees, right? We don't want to identify them as someone else or something like that. We don't want to automatically enroll people without their consent. We don't want to show sensitive data without, basically, if we have identified someone, but they haven't asked for sensitive data, we should not show it. And then some places where it's okay to kind of get it wrong is like detecting non-human faces as humans. So like pictures or paintings. It's hard to do. This is actually where there's a whole deepfake discussion or the idea of like identification of fraudulent images, not fraudulent, but like, one of the problems you have with facial recognition is that if you do not do things that are called signs of life detection, which is a lot to do with like deepfake detection, you can actually pull a picture off of the wall of the place you're at and show it to the camera and will probably detect it as a human being and actually identify them. And the reason why is because you actually need to then do a bunch of other stuff to detect that that's actually the person as an embodied person. Like your heart rate, for example, at a higher enough camera rate, you can actually detect heart rate fluctuations in the flush of your skin, for example. So there's like a bunch of stuff there that's like very interesting. But at that point in that time, it seemed like it was okay that if we saw a picture on the wall, we tried to detect it as a person, it was probably okay. It was annoying, but it was okay. We want to not detect any faces due to the environment. And what I mean by that is that like non-pictures or paintings, we don't want to do like that type of thing. We don't want to identify enrollees if they aren't confident. So like if it's too low of a light or they're too far away or if it's the side of their face, it's okay if they don't get identified immediately, like all the time. And that allowing someone else to use the device if the enrollee is identified. So if the enrollee is identified, the screen has been personalized for them. It's okay if someone just walks up and starts playing with the device based on their person. And that is because like they're still in the room. We will auto undetect them at a certain point, but there was kind of like a middle ground that we're like, this is probably okay based on the way the norms work inside of households. But you can see here that these could be on either side of acceptable or not acceptable, but we've deemed them to be kind of like okay, but still not ideal, right? And so I think that's an important distinction to make. And finally, vulnerability is like, we don't want to access sensitive data just automatically. And then we wanted to, in some way, like worry about not detecting or misidentifying people based on this. And so we wouldn't, this is where like a lot of work needs to go into what we mean by this. And this is like the discussion starter is really what this is. So I hope that makes sense in the way that those things would kind of pull together. With that, that's all I wanted to talk about today. So I still have like a little bit of time for questions, but that's kind of how I've thought about across a bunch of different experiences, how to be like a product person inside this like AI ML world. There's a bunch of techniques that I've used. I think the design policies one is really unique because I think we can start to create like specifications or PRDs, or even just like user stories with design policies inside of them that become a much better discussion between kind of like technical and non-technical people. So yeah. Any questions I can help answer?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
I came a little bit late, but
No problem.
so when you're thinking through the scenarios as the user, as a persona of how they would react to your product or as they go through their day, their job to be done,
yeah,
how do you try to identify the gaps in your knowledge? Like you think you know the person, but there's something that person does or hate that you totally don't even know to ask that question. And that's what can really get you. Like when I got I had a Google Home device. I ended up returning it for some of the things you talked about. Like, I personalized it, I hooked up my Gmail account, recognized my voice. I have twins. And one of my twins sounds like me. So
Exactly.
he's like, Dad, I bet you I can unlock it. Like his
Yeah.
voice is speak like he's I think he was only 19 at the time.
Amazing.
He goes up like, no, you can't do it. So he's like, okay, Dad, talk for a little bit. And it's like, okay, I got your tone. And he goes in there, and within 2 minutes, the thing unlocks. And I was like, that's it. This thing is going
Totally.
back.
Totally.
And also like the whole idea of, okay, I personalized it. Now it's showing me all this stuff about my account, my history. I'm like, I mean, I'm not doing
Yeah.
any crazy stuff, but I just don't
No,
want
no, I
to.
know. Yeah. No, you
So
want privacy. Like privacy is all about the idea of like mismatching of kind of the norms of a situation with the data that's being transmitted. And so it's completely fine that like there are certain cases where you want to have privacy and there's others you don't. And it's just like the way the
right,
world is, right? Like it's like the idea of like my kids are still pretty young. They're from like 2 to 9, essentially. So there's like the 9-year-old is still borderline on the case where he can walk in on the bathroom when I'm in the bathroom, right? There's a certain point where it's no longer going to be acceptable from a norms perspective, right? And so, anyways, I just think there's a concept called contextual integrity, if you want to look that up. Really interesting privacy kind of framework and theory that I think gets at a lot of this stuff. But getting to your main question, which is like, how do you detect these types of things? Is I think through user research, I think one of the things that's most important when you do user research is that you ask a lot of very open-ended, clean language questions to start. And so it's not like, do you like this? Or tell me how you imagine you would do this thing. It's like the last time you did this, what happened? And you're trying to understand this stuff because like I think in your case too, the idea of like twins was definitely something that came up in our research around like issues for biometric recognition because we're looking at like how do people look similar to each other, right? And so that's like maybe the most extreme case. But even just like inside of a family, right? Like biological parents of someone will look similar to them in certain ways, right? And so like even that was then something we had to worry about. So I think it's like a combination of very open-ended generative user research about the problem you're trying to solve and asking it in such a way that you can get the full story, right? And then the other side is kind of seeking out actually talking to those people that are not necessarily like I hate calling them edge cases. At Facebook we would call them stress cases because they were cases that like would cause harm for someone. And so I think seeking out those possibilities ends up being really, really important. And one of the things that I think there's a couple of things you could do around that, like pre-mortems are a great way to talk about like the way you could fail. I've used it's called confusion mapping, but it's like the idea of a confusion matrix inside of statistics is like true positive and true negatives, but then ideating where all the false positives and negatives that could happen here, and then stack ranking them based on like the harm that happens from that. So I think as a group activity, starting to actually dive into that. And there's like another thing called moral imaginations, which inside my Maven course, we actually do a workshop around this, but there's a paper I can send you from Google where they would do this, where they would create scenarios about the future based on technology. And then we would have a role play between a hypothetical Google, which is called like Noogle, I think is what they would call it, and then a journalistic group and a governmental group. And we would start to talk about like, what are the harms that are taking place here? And I think you get down into this realm of like, we have values as an organization that we want to uphold, and we should be making decisions in the product based on those values. Usually we have to discover and write down those values and agree to them and align around them first, because I don't think everybody has that type of discussion. But then once we do, we then start to need to do these things like future studies or design fiction or whatever to then start to understand how does that impact our decision making today. And if you find that there are harms that are going to be there, you should seek out people that will then do that. Now, the problem is with like AI machine learning, it does things that we will not expect, especially inside of systems. So I think the last piece is really about like, how do you do incident response and training? And so if something is out in the world, you should practice what does it mean to have a problem come up and how fast you fix it. So like if you notice now, whenever there's a new jailbreak for ChatGPT, it gets fixed within a day or two. So clearly OpenAI has a process for fixing these things now, right? Because it's happened so often. So I think, and there's like an article I'm writing for this like business journal right now, where the last thing that you want to do is like this kind of like practicing of incident response inside of chaos engineering or SRE. There's this idea of like game day where you practice what happens. And so I think that's another thing you should do as like an organization is what's the worst case here? And this should be called like PR training, like how do you react to the worst case scenario? But I think we do it now in like a functional sense of like, if this happened in the outside world, how would let's pretend we have to react to this right now as a product team. What do we do? Right. And so getting that type of experience, I think is really interesting in that case too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
This is great information.
Okay.
I really appreciate you coming and sharing it with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lot to think about. And
Yeah. Usually my presentations are very dense with like models and references and stuff like that. So if there's anything that I'll try to send you, I'm happy to share the slides. And then if there's anything that you're really interested in reading about that I can send you the links to. And then in general, I think maybe just as closing here, I mean, like I said, I'm kind of gearing up for a Maven course that's focused on design, like AI design patterns. So I'd love to get feedback from you on any of these stories or about things that are helpful or not helpful, things I should dwell on more, things I should maybe skip over, anything like that. Super helpful to me. You don't have to send it through this program, but if you want to just like connect on LinkedIn, I would love to hear your thoughts about it. And then as you try this stuff out, I'm always open to like asynchronously just hearing how it goes, because I think some of these practices are good in certain circumstances, but not others. So you should use these things as experiments for the way you actually get better understanding. And even if it fails as like a process or a framework or methodology, at least you learn something about the domain that you're in, right? And so that's all I'd say is like none of these things are 100% effective. They're just like, as product managers, as you build your expertise, you get these like huge toolbox of things to try out, and you try them out when you think they're appropriate, and you build intuition around which things to use in which circumstances, basically.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for everything, by the way. I have to
Welcome.
echo what Patty said and with everything. The book you referenced that you had a partner with examples or content for interaction design stuff.
Yeah, that's
the new version coming out. You said?
Yeah. So I can't. Well,
you can't say when.
I think I can't say when because I don't know actually. Like I left Google in January of this year and I'm at GitHub now. But like supposedly it is coming out sometime this year. And I know they've been gearing up for some stuff, but it was supposed to not only include a more specific kind of focus on generative systems and what does that change around nuance, but also I tried to give it more of like a product manager bent when it was very designer and research focused. I just put it in the chat for the Zoom if you want to look at it. But the Pair Guidebook, I think, is an amazing resource in general. It's been around since I think like 2017 or 18 or something like that. I've been a big fan for a long time. So it was kind of a dream to be able to contribute. Again, there's hundreds of people that are involved in this product, by the way. But I was just like, I gave a small contribution. I really love it. And there's a lot of cool stuff that's in there too.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've done some interaction design, professional development stuff.
Oh, cool.
So, I've been curious about what might be coming.
Yeah, that's
and these, especially just in the last year with the AI impact.
Yeah.
So
and there's a lot. Like I've been starting to just like collect articles that are about different frameworks that people have, because like even for AI like UX patterns, I think I've collected like 8 or 9 articles at this point, including the Pair Guidebook, that are just like, here's the way I think about these different frameworks. And I had one like back in 2019 when I was doing this like design thinking for AI workshop that I would think about, right? So I guess what I'm trying to think about now is like, what are the systems way of thinking about these things and what does it mean? And I think it comes down to the spectrum of like tool to agent and trust to not trust. I think ends up being a lot about that stuff, but it comes down to like trust and interpretability is really the way I think about it. And so anyways, like I think that's a good one. That is what my actual course is about. If you're interested, I'm happy to give you guys a discount or whatever. So just let me know. But yeah, that I think this is a great one. The Pair Guidebook is probably the best one that's out there. But I've seen, like I've said, like maybe 8 or 9 or 10 of these different things that are out there as far as frameworks. So just use what you think is appropriate and valuable is what I would argue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And along these lines, there's something I shared in our community for our group, but I thought, with your passion, that's obvious, and some key things you talked about today, maybe you're already aware, but PIP decks, have you ever heard of PIP decks? They're awesome. Yeah, I have. Yeah, I have. Yeah.
I mean, I have like 7 or 8 card decks that are right
you're
here.
On it.
But no, well, so I wrote the other group that I was, so there's Try Triggers. I like a lot as well. That's these ones. And I actually helped write the machine learning deck for Try Triggers. I wrote it, and then the founder like helps edit it and everything like that. Awesome. So I'm a big believer. I love pip decks as well. Like I haven't gotten their workshop one. I know they just came out with a new archetype one, but I'm a big fan of this. The strategy one. I know the people that wrote this one, and so I'm a big fan of that. Although I don't use this one as much because I think the way I use it is if I am building a workshop and I don't know what to do, I'll just like flip through a bunch of these cards and see which ones might be more valuable. That's what I use this for. Whereas I use like Try Triggers, Oblique Strategies, or tarot cards. to actually just create randomness inside my practice.
Uh-huh. I have the
Yeah.
storytelling and workshop.
Okay, cool. Yeah, here's my writer deck.
Excellent.
Cool.
Thanks again.
Yeah, I probably have a box like this big full of card decks. So I'm a big believer in that method around randomization. And if you're interested, I did do a talk about like randomization and decision making, and I'm part of this like basically a community around decision making and strategy called the Uncertainty Project. And so I wrote a whole article about like randomness inside of decision making and ideation and stuff like that. And so you should check that out too. I think, anyways, if you're into those types of card deck things. So
thanks again.
Are you?
I do have to.
Are you Chris Butler, chaotic or?
Yeah, chaotic good
Product
manager.
manager on LinkedIn.
Yeah. So please just connect with me, and then I'll share a bunch of links after this and can get to you however is appropriate. I do have to run to another meeting right now, but yeah, thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the great questions. And yeah, just let me know if I can help with anything.
Great, Chris. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Wow, that was amazing. Yeah, I loved
Thank
it.
That was great.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know some of the most amazing people.
Oh, thank you. We'll,
Mhm.
I think we'll bring Chris onto this full day workshop. We'll also help him for I'm just thinking out loud so you know how I network, right? So now I'm gonna network with Chris. I'm gonna tell him, hey, let me yeah, this is recorded. Okay, that's fine. So what I'm gonna do next, this is how I'm networking, right? So leading with value. I'm just gonna do this right real time in front of you guys. So I brought him in. We paid him a little bit, but not like the market rate because he's a good friend. So I brought him in, and man, I wish I never said that. But anyways, this is all being recorded. Okay, so we are all out in the open. So I brought him in, and he cut me a big deal because you know, he's a good friend. Anyway, so the point is now I'm gonna reward him. I'm gonna reward him big time because he did a big, you know, he gave me a big thing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw an event, full day event for him and 3 other people. Like I think it's gonna be the author of the book Reimagined, AI Reimagined. I think her name is Shivi. So Shivi is a product lead at LinkedIn. So I'm gonna bring 3 or 4 really amazing, sharp people in the space. I'm gonna do a full day workshop for them. I'm gonna make Chris one of the speakers. I'm gonna fill up the room with like 100 people. You guys are gonna be having reserved front VIP seating for you to interact with the speakers. And I will do this at Microsoft Reactor. So I just dreamed up all of this in the last 3 minutes. And that's going to be your final event. Like that's going to be your final May event. But the reason I could do this now is because I have all the connections were already there, latently sitting. Now they just came together, right? So I know the connection at Microsoft Reactor. Her name is I forgot her name. I think her name is Roxana, right? So I know her. She wants to do a full day event. I know you guys wanna. I have promised you guys a full day event, and I know Chris is amazing. He's got a course coming up, so I'm gonna help him like prepare and pitch that course and refine that material. And then I'll find 2 other sharp people like that, and we'll do a full day workshop, and that will be a free workshop. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's amazing. I love seeing you invent and build on this as it's going. I mean, I think what a privilege we have to be in this first cohort and see it develop and see how it happens in real time.
Yeah, you are shaping it. Literally, you are shaping it, Patty. You are all shaping this experience as it goes based on the feedback I'm getting. So yeah, I'm continuing to get better, and we'll make this a high value community of AI entrepreneurs, right? So that's my vision, to create a strong, vibrant community of AI entrepreneurs building real 7+ figure businesses on their own, bootstrapping in less than like reasonable amount of time, very reasonable time. Yeah, 3-4 months.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. My only ask of all is like, as soon as you know the date, just kind of let us know, because obviously I need, if I fly in from DC, I want to like book it sooner rather than later, you know.
100%. Yeah.
Yep.
Let me share that. Yeah, go for it, James.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you anticipating having this event by the time we're done? like in the middle of May. Because I'm gonna be leaving California to go to a couple different places, including Mother's Day to see my elderly mom, right? So I'm not gonna be in California from May 9th to the 24th of May. Yeah, May 9th.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. We'll all need some space after this is completed to unwind and just like
Yeah.
get back to. So I think it will be at least 3 to 4 weeks away, most likely second or third week of June.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Now that I'm thinking out loud.
'Cause
Yeah,
I'll be in
I don't
Spain
think I can pull it off on May 25th. Go for it. Yeah, go for it. That's when we have the reservation for the whole location. I have a recurring reservation at Microsoft Reactor on 25th of every month. I don't think I can pull it off on May 25th. So yeah, sorry. Yeah, go for it, Vlad.
No, I was just gonna say I'm gone for half of May. I'll be in Spain, so I'm glad that you're not doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it in June. I think it's better if I have a little more time to bring in Chevy and like one more technical person.
Oh, and FYI, I just threw a link into it, the chat,
Mhm.
this meeting chat. It's a book called Innovators High. It's got an interesting perspective. But anyway, I was in San Francisco waiting in line to get a taco, and I made small talk with someone who was redoing the website. And I had done a little bit of UX stuff, professional development. It was years ago. And I gave him notes on what he was going to change. He had a few ideas. We talked for a little while. He's a German guy. And then I ended up staying in touch because he became a freelance client and now still a friend. He was writing this book and he wanted me to proofread some stuff. And I gave him all notes that were not proofreading because I kind of believed in some of the things he had in here. But it's just the way he kind of reframed creativity, sport of ideas. And there are a couple of good things in here, especially the storytelling he does chapter by chapter. But I thought it was a really, it's a pretty easy read, but I contributed to a bunch of content here, revisions and stuff. And I just like the passion he had for it because it's relevant to some of the stuff we're doing. I put it in here, not to promote the book. If you go to the web, not to promote buying it or anything like that, that's not where I'm coming from. It has a website, but when you go to the website, it says not secure, but it is secure. Just as the way the browser reads it. But I know it's a secure website for the book because he finished creating it when I was part of that process. But it'll say not secure. That's why I didn't share it, because you'll be like, what did he just give us? But it's fine if you go to the website itself for Innovators High. Then you get a little bit more of a summary about the book and everything. And there's descriptions about the areas of the book. So yeah,
Awesome.
that's
Thank
all.
you.
Anyway, I just, yeah, thanks for your patience on that share. I just thought I'd throw that in there at the end.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone from anyone? Before we wrap. I think I'm gonna have to do a feedback gym session, an extra feedback gym session next week for aligning on your tech stacks. So I'll probably throw in a extra bonus 1 hour feedback gym next week, early next week, for us to go through your tech stacks and just sign off on that.
Okay.
Hey, Deval, I need small help. Can I schedule a call with you like next week, early next week?
Yeah, let's what I would love to do is do it during this bonus session that I just announced, Vijay. So that way others can get benefit from it too.
Oh, when is that? Because I joined late actually, so I'm not sure when was.
Yeah, I just announced it. 30 seconds ago.
Oh, that's
So
June 1, right? June 1, right? The June 1.
No, not June 1. Just it's happening next week. I'll create a 1 hour session for all of us.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Okay.
Okay. Vijay, I do have a feedback for your enterprise product. Like if you can't find the pricing page, it's because they are priced very high in their enterprise products. So you probably don't want to build something like that. But I'll chat with you separately one-on-one. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, you can do it later on.